No, real quick too. Going in the state selling Timothy Street. So one way. Well, it's Harry and Lucy Friday. Harry was the meter reader for years. Yeah. Cute little house. Nice things. How's retirement after 1.5 years? What you been doing?
Everything. My wife says, I'm gonna show you the ways.
No, I got you.
You're outside doing lawn work.
Okay.
I saw that.
And I said,
I didn't see anything coming up until it was planted. That's great.
house maintenance guy now.
Yeah,
Their worst fates.
that's what happens.
We'll be getting underway in about 30 seconds. That's it.
But you, there's nothing I can do.
I need a printer that big.
Bring him down here.
I can do it by my phone.
Oh, I know. He's probably
Her
gonna
machine's not turning on. And I
Yeah,
don't
we
think she
Oh,
can
yeah.
log into this
Rowing
one
the
and
laptop.
get her council stuff.
How's everything in your neighborhood?
Rolling. Right. We'll be getting underway in 10, 9,
Yeah, I think I'm going to. I mean, I might get started. We'll see. Okay.
5, 4. Good evening and welcome to this special meeting of Defiance City Council tonight, Tuesday, May 17th, 2022. Before we get underway, let's bow our heads in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this evening and for the weather, for the opportunity to get together to discuss the matters of the city and how we can best care for the citizens and steward the resources we've been given. Please give us wisdom, cooperation, and understanding in these endeavors. Lord, we pray that we may glorify you with this effort. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I'd like to call this meeting to order. Let the record show that all members of council are present. As we get underway, would you stand with me for the pledge? I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As announced earlier, this is a special meeting that we have a committee meeting of the whole to discuss the master sidewalk plan. But first, we also have a couple ordinances up for discussion before we get to that. Is elders? I could read it.
It's okay. Second reading by caption only, an ordinance amending the district map to rezone property located in Noble Township for an R2 medium-density residential district to an R3 medium to high-density residential district, planned unit development overlay, and declare an emergency.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, and again, just like last week, I'll take these next two ordinances together, provide that you vote on each separately. And these two ordinances, one being for a map amendment or a zoning amendment for this planned unit development, the other one is for the preliminary plan. And the bills before you tonight do the R3 medium to high density residential district. And finally, it approves the uses, densities, and conditions of that preliminary plan only. Now, I want to emphasize, it is just a preliminary plan. It will not be recorded at the county recorder. That would be what we would do with the final plan. And it's not as detailed as the final plan. So you may, I know that the city engineer had some comments on the subdivision and the development, those will be addressed in the final plan. Now, the City Planning Commission held two public hearings, February 22nd and March 21st respectively. And Planning Commission did recommend both the map amendment and the preliminary plan for this planned unit development. At those meetings, the commission received feedback from both city staff and concerned residents and adjusted their plan accordingly to include revised ingress and egress plans for the development in order to avoid access through Valley Forge Drive and begin the development at the east end of the site. You as council held the required public hearing last week on May 3rd, held the first reading on May 10th, and you're here tonight for an up or down vote, approval with modifications or disapproval. And your decision tonight is critical because there has to be some sort of vote within 15 days of that May 3rd public hearing, or we have to start part of the process over.
Questions or comments for Mr. O'Donnell? Mr. Uresti?
My comment, I have three comments to this project. Number one, I feel the preliminary project and reading it, and looking at it, if preliminary project comes out with new housing for our community, I think it's something that our community needs desperately at this point. If we're gonna grow and bring new business in, we're gonna need housing for those people. And the last thing, I think Mr. O'Donnell addressed it, they are listening to some of the concerns of the people in the neighborhoods, and they did make those adjustments. I think overall this is a good project, and I support this. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions or comments from council? If no questions or comments from council, any questions or comments from the citizens? Right. What are council's wishes in these regards? Mr. Uresti?
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt?
Second.
Second.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
We will have to suspend the rules prior to adoption because we haven't done the three
Right.
readings.
Motion suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call.
I'll second.
Second, Mr. Hancock.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Hancock.
Second.
Second, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Right. The ordinance amending the district map to rezone is adopted. Would you read the caption for the second?
Second reading by caption only, an ordinance approving a preliminary plan for the property located at 1850 North Clinton Street and declaring an emergency.
And anything to add with the second one?
Nothing to add here. It's the same as last time, except this is for the preliminary plan.
Okay. Mr. Uresti?
There are other questions, motion suspend and call.
If we have no other questions, we have a motion to suspend and call.
Second.
Second, Mr. Corbett.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Crutch.
Second.
Second, Mr. Corbett.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And this ordinance approving the preliminary plan is adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank the Planning Commission Council for your questions, your support, and your approval. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. With the items of legislation this evening addressed, we do have a committee meeting of the whole in order to discuss the master sidewalk plan. Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we're having some technical difficulty at this point. I
Yes.
do know that this presentation is put in their Dropbox.
Yes, it's in everybody's Dropbox under sidewalk repairs. Sorry, everyone.
We tested the system at 6:15, it was working fine.
Working like a charm.
Yeah, so that's technology.
Lisa, what file was that again?
Sidewalk repairs.
Thank you.
Sidewalks. Keep going down.
Let me kick things off here. Joe, you've expressed an interest in just a sidewalk program and just where the city needs to go. I can even reference a memo that you had wrote in 21, that you had several concerns about financing and just a number of different issues that we have with sidewalks today. And as I go through this is really kind of split up into two sections, really. It's our sidewalk program and what we have in terms of what we have on in our code. And then to get a little bit more futuristic, there is a part of this that talks about active transportation. And I'll give you the definition of what active transportation is. But the Defiance County and Maumee Valley had put something together some time ago to talk about active transportation concepts. And as we move forward through this, I will talk about the second half of this as being active transportation, because I think it really does pertain to programs that we've initiated and things that we've done, and just what we're trying to promote within the community. And I think from a visual aid standpoint, you'll see that we are taking these steps. Obviously, I start this out by creating what a definition of a sidewalk is according to our own ordinance. Sidewalk means that it's the portion of the street between the curb lines or the lateral lines of a roadway and the adjacent property lines intended for the use of pedestrians. And I think as we move on, you will certainly, everybody knows what a sidewalk is. I mean, I don't have to give you that definition, but when you start to talk about what a sidewalk is, my next definition sort of goes hand in hand with it, because the next definition I'm about to give you is what's called a use path. And we use that term, we've used that term when we were making improvements on East High Street. That term has been used sort of interchangeably from time to time. And a shared use path means a bikeway outside the travel way and physically separate from motorized vehicular traffic by an open space or barrier. A shared use path also may be used by pedestrians, including skaters, joggers, users of manual and motorized wheelchairs, and other authorized motorized and non-motorized users. A shared use path does not include any trail that is intended to be used primarily for mountain biking, hiking, equestrian use, and other similar uses. Today's standards, we're getting more and more involved in what we call shared use paths. And if you want to see some example of a shared use path, really all you have to do is look at the purple map, and if it's easier for you to look behind you, you might want to try to do that. A shared use path would be like out at the 15 roundabout, where you are seeing big, wide sidewalk, what you would call a sidewalk, but this is an intended use for multi-use, bikers, walkers. It could be used for scooters. It could be used for a number of different reasons. The point is it's multi-use and it's wide enough that you're not going to be hit by somebody else. There's a lot of room on a shared use path. You'll see a shared use path from Ottawa Avenue into Carnes Park. You'll see that there's a pathway that actually goes back to the park area from Ottawa. The intended use is the shared use path for pedestrians, bikers, those sort of things. So as we move along and we move into the future, shared use is really something that I don't believe is really, you'll see it in our code, but as we move along with these active transportation concepts, shared use paths are something that most communities are adopting by today's standards. I'll talk about future uses of shared use paths in a minute. But I think that to really get, to kind of get to the, what I would call the meat and potatoes of this discussion, we can go on to like duties of sidewalks, section 90507. And it's a duty to clean the sidewalk, removal of snow and ice. Most people don't realize it. We do realize it because it seems like every winter, you know, I field questions on why so-and-so didn't shovel a walk, or, you know, there's a business out north, and we've seen that from time and time again. The duty of maintaining sidewalks is really placed on the property owner of that parcel. This code talks about that, and you can see by this description of any person having possession of the lot or land in the city shall clear the portion of the sidewalk adjacent to his or her lot or parcel of all accumulations of snow and ice within a 24-hour after the cessation of a storm. So again, it's that property owner. The city may have put that sidewalk in. They may not feel like, gee, that's, you know, that's not mine, that's the city's. That's not true. That parcel of property is, even within the right-of-way, that homeowner or that property owner has the responsibility to maintain that sidewalk. And I think most people, I'm not sure, understand that. I would say most residential owners understand that, but you're getting into something where this is the code, this is what we've had on the books for some time. We've contacted other municipalities and had talks with them. You're going to see this kind of language in most codes in the state of Ohio and most municipal governments. That's what we found. You'll see some deviations from that. We'll maybe get into that a little bit later. But the duty of sidewalks is the property owner's responsibility. Again, on the next slide, 905.08, repair and maintenance. Not just the clearing of debris or snow and ice, but also repair and maintenance of sidewalks is something that's placed on the property owner. And we've known for some time that, look, we have seen a deterioration of sidewalks. Some we've actually stepped up to the plate as a government where we believe that trees in the right-of-way, the public right-of-way, have maybe uprooted some of those sidewalks, and we have a program where we have adopted different areas where we've identified what we're going to do in a given budgetary year. I think this year we have some 47,000, 40,000, somewhere in there. Fix some of these sidewalks that have been uprooted by trees. So again, the government, the local government, is going to step up to that and repair a sidewalk. For the most part, I will tell you that in looking at sidewalks, we have not, and for a number of reasons, I think because mainly in terms of actually having a program where we want people to go out and repair their sidewalks, and we want to put it on the burden of the property owner. One tool that we have in our toolbox is through the assessment process. I think if you look at Mr. Urusti's memo back in 21, I think he talks about this. He talks about questions about should the city participate 50% in this and put half of it on the property owner. And I think what the whole point of tonight's meeting is to get to a level of where are we going with these issues that we have on the books that are enforceable. And I will say this much. I think it does give a number of gives a large responsibility to the city administrator, and I will talk about that once we go through these code sections. So again, 90508, the property owner is required to repair and maintain their sidewalks. Okay, the next slide, which is 90509, it just talks about stub toes and and slopes and just it gets into more engineering concepts about what you should be looking at in terms of the sidewalk itself, these vertical misalignments and problems that we've seen, and the height of those misalignments and the ratios. And in the past, I can tell you, back in the early 90s, we had our engineering division going out and actually measuring stub toes, and we had a program where we actually enforced the sidewalk program. We have not enforced that program since the early 90s. With that said, and looking at the next slide, this is a slide that shows a number of sidewalks and trails within the city. It's very difficult to see on this screen. You would almost have to blow it up. But here are the legends of what you're seeing on the maps that are behind me. And what you see in green are sidewalks that are really on both sides of the street, okay? It will talk about, there's like 60 miles of sidewalks on both sides of the street. If you see and you look at this map in yellow, there are sidewalks on one side of the street. But you should also note that in looking at a map such as what we have here today, you will notice that there are several neighborhoods that don't have any sidewalks. You can go out and you can look at Kettering Addition, you can look at Johnson Circle, you can look at the Tarrawanda area, you can go out to Wooded Acres and look at those subdivisions, Powellview Heights. You can go into a number of different subdivisions and look at areas that have no sidewalks, period. So when we have these code sections, okay, we have these tools in our toolbox where we can assess those property owners, but somebody made a decision a long time ago when they were going through the planning process of saying, okay, we're not going to require you to have sidewalks. We are going to make some decisions about your subdivision, and you know what? What you'll see in most of these subdivisions, you do see people walking on the street. People like to take walks. They want to move from point A to point B within their subdivision. Those people are walking on the streets. There are no sidewalks. And most people, you will see, I don't think you really see many people walking in the streets within the Laddie's Grove area. There's sidewalks there. They've used those sidewalks. And really what you're doing in looking at placing the burden of the property owner and looking at an assessment project is that you have to understand that in looking at what we have in our city, some of those subdivisions have sidewalks, some don't. And actually some of those subdivisions, or what I will call connecting points, and we'll get into that a little bit later, maybe should have sidewalks that don't. And I think as I talk about these active transportation concepts, you will see that I think this community, this administration has promoted more and more trails, has promoted more and more shared use paths that you'll see. And in terms of these sidewalks and what we have, it's really kind of a hodgepodge thing. We've put what you see in purple here, or what we would call shared use path. There are future areas that I'll talk about a little later where I think we're looking at shared use paths as additional infrastructure improvements. But again, in our and other communities, we've looked at a couple different communities that have had their code since, for a very long time. They haven't actually enforced their sidewalk program, some since 2011. So again, I think in looking at really trying to give you a flavor of what's out there, we have not seen some of the municipalities have it on the books. They haven't enforced it. I think that would be true for our community, okay? Next slide.
Jeff,
Yeah.
was there a particular impetus for stopping the enforcement that was going on in the nineties? I mean,
Yeah, I think for
kind of
one,
fade away.
yeah, I think, number one, there were a lot of complaints. I think that they were, trying to make an argument that this was an undue financial burden on the property. They didn't feel like, part of the right-of-way in some of those older subdivisions and some of the older neighborhoods, you'll see a wide area within the subdivision, and they might say, well, that's part of the government's, they should fix it. I mean, there were a number of different reasons. I can tell you at the time, there's no question that the engineer at that point took a lot of complaints. I mean, a political issue than anything. And I think that that's the thing that you certainly have to watch for. I think that, and I kind of stopped it here because right now is the time to have a discussion about what we've been seeing and what we've been dealing with in terms of sidewalks. I can tell you, in just dealing with the first attribute that you see on the screen with strategic areas, I think what we would like to see is more infrastructure that might connect places a bit better. And I can give you some of the examples that I'm talking about there. For example, if you would look at the corridor down Stadium Drive or even Carpenter Road, you still see people walking on the roadway or on the streets. And the answer to that is, yes, you have the tool of assessment to use if you so choose. We have had issues with South Clinton Street. We've made a decision that we believe that to be a real safety issue, and the government has said, we're not gonna let that go on. We're gonna step up and we're going to, you've seen flags out there today. We're taking the necessary steps to engineer that and actually replace that. So it really is, and Sean, you might wanna talk about this a little bit. We, as the government, can choose what we wanna push forward and enforce and what we kind of wanna relax the issues on. Think about this for a second, okay? Here we are trying to clean up nuisance properties, cleaning up their properties, taking care of some of the trash that we've seen, some of the junk cars, and you constantly have to keep up with that. But then what you're gonna do in some of these places is place that burden of fixing their sidewalk and that financial burden on people that, actually will question whether or not they even want a sidewalk or they wanna repair their sidewalk. This is the hodgepodge that we get to deal with in this community, because you see some of those areas that have sidewalks, some don't. We as a community, I think, are really promoting more active transportation concepts where we want people to be more active. We want them to bike, we want them to walk, we want to create more activity with our citizens. So those are the kind of things that we're pushing out to our own constituents. And if I go back into the 90s, there were a lot of problems with the program back then, so much so that I think that we've sort of left it on the shelf, so to speak. Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah.
And I think the big thing is, and those are the, from what I wrote earlier in 19, also in 20. Thank you. The strategic areas are was what I looked at as the main concern of city council and the administration, and talking about the where do we start first? We talk about the entire city. Let's say, okay, are we going to do the entire city, or are we going to start segments of the city? And I like what you were talking about earlier about identifying those areas. And in that memo that I put out earlier, I talked about my impression, I think I heard it from the administration, that you guys had 16 city gateways that you guys identified.
Yeah.
So if we identify those as being our priority and work from the outside in towards the middle, what it does, it minimizes something that's huge into something that's workable. And then at that point, we can start looking at what are the priorities of those 16 that need to be fixed first. Is it something that major projects are being potentially are going to be built in those areas, like the Carpenter Road area?
Yeah.
Or other areas that have industrial areas that are going to be developed. Maybe those are the areas that we start first, or whatever. But we do have 16 gateways, as far as my understanding, that we can address first, and then see which is in priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then over 20 years to see which ones we do, and then we look at our budgets and then try to see whether we do it ourselves, because it's something of a main importance, where you have to travel to those new destinations like splash pad, so on and so forth,
Right.
or something else.
And, I mean, and Ryan, you can speak to this, because I think you were on the phone with a community that talked about targeted areas and targeting certain areas and targeting areas where either the government's going to come in and make the replacement, or it's going to be a shared responsibility, or even it might be an area where it's on the property owner. But maybe you want to talk a little bit about that targeted area.
Yes, there's a couple of different ways to do it. One would be dividing the city into different zones, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and looking at each different zone and saying, okay, for the next few years, we're going to focus on Zone A. We're going to look to what does the city owe to fixing up some of these? What are we going to be putting on the property owners to make sure that those property owners in that zone right now are getting their sidewalks up to code, up to standard? It would give people a heads up to know in the next coming years that is coming down the pike towards their community. And then you can look at one zone, get to a point where you feel comfortable with it, and then say, okay, we're moving to Zone B. We're gonna start looking at that. Another way that a couple communities had talked about, and again, this goes back to all of this is in these communities' codes. It's not necessarily what these communities are enforcing right now, though. It is in there, but it's not necessarily what they're doing, but it is an idea. They look at, council looks at every year and says, this is a safety zone for us. This is the area we as a city are gonna focus on. Sometimes that safety zone expands one year, sometimes it contracts down to just a main area that they wanna continually focus on for improvements. And so that's something left up to the city council of that community to decide, to declare where that safety zone will be from year to year, whether it expands, whether it contracts. But you can look at those different angles.
One other point that Ryan just made, and it goes to Mr. Mass' question, why wasn't it enforced, is you could have the most well-written code. We could hire consultants, pay them six-figure sums, and come up with the most well-written codes, but it would not matter if there's not the political will to see it through. This code is not perfect, right? It was written in the 80s, and laws aren't written in a vacuum. What was happening in the 80s, everybody was fleeing the cities. The dream was to move out to the suburbs with Leave It to Beaver. And you wouldn't have conversations about active transportation, Jeff, or shared use plans, or even gateways, Mr. Uresti, because everybody would look at you and say, why would you want to walk? That's what poor people do. And so we're just going to assess the property owner. That was the attitude back then. I think now you're making some connections with strategic areas, gateway areas, downtown areas, where there may be a public interest beyond simply the benefit to the adjacent or abutting property for the assessment. And this code, flawed as it may be, gives you the ability to do that.
Just,
Mr. Mast.
that begs my other question. Is this something we're looking to rewrite our codified ordinance to reflect something more enforceable, or is this something that we're gonna look outside of the code as more of a plan that it's developed?
Well, I hate to punt, Mr. Mass, but that's kind of why we're having this discussion.
Right, I didn't know
Because-
if I were jumping ahead on you here.
No, I think now's the time to ask that question, because that's a very good question. But I think that that is something that has to go hand in hand with this legislative body and this administration. And I don't think it does us any good I think it's one of those things where both parties has to be on the same page and understand what we're trying to promote here. I think if you look at enforcement action, I think that we have seen enough through nuisance control and just, vacant properties, that placing that burden, additional burden right now it's gonna be tough for people. And you're gonna get some political backlash from that. And I don't even think it's about the political backlash. I think it's more about what do we wanna do as a community, and how are we going to do it, and what are we going to identify, and how are we gonna move forward, and understanding that those resources are limited, not just for us, but for those people as well. And just come up with a plan that says, or a concept that says, this is how we're gonna treat this. Because I don't think, we've talked about sidewalks forever. And really, we should stop talking about it and start to look at the future. And I can tell you, when Sean said the code was written in the 80s, he's absolutely right. It was written in the 80s, okay? 40 years ago. Things have changed. And I think that as we have written that code, and we also made some decisions with some of these other subdivisions to say, nah, you don't have to put sidewalks in, that's okay. We're gonna give you a break, I know it's gonna cost you money. No, you don't have to do it in that subdivision, you don't have to do it over here. And then you have some of the older neighborhoods that were some of the plotted areas in this community years ago, and guess what? In the 50s, it might have been real important to have those sidewalks. And I think it's important to have those sidewalks today. But again, we have to make some decisions about where we are going as a community with some of these issues. And it's not that easy to
Mr. Corbett?
And I understand what you're saying, and this will continue to be a political issue well past our time, I think. Is there a way, you keep talking about a community issue, that we should involve the community in some of these discussions to see where they may want to go? Is there a way, if funding's an issue, is there a way to come up with 0.5% tax to fund some of this stuff? That's a bad word too, I know that, but you can't move forward without the money to move forward. And if you could designate a portion of this revenue coming in, however we do it, just for these specific projects. And then one more question, you're talking about shared use paths. I think the state likes to push those now more than sidewalks because they're more beneficial for more people. Is there grant funding available?
There's great that as we move forward, because you've seen it on the east side. You look at that roundabout, and if you look at that shared use path that goes from that roundabout down Cleveland Avenue, that's pretty impressive. That shared use path is also going to go down, hopefully, Ottawa Avenue, and that's going to tie into a sidewalk. And you're going to see people get off the roadway, and they're going to be able to use the kind of infrastructure in that neighborhood that they have deserved for a long period of time. I don't know that, of course, it's easy to, let's put X percent away in a property tax or an income tax or whatever. I think you have to study that longer. I think you have to really get your citizens involved in that process before you pull the trigger on that.
That's the place to start then? Should we involve them now before let's start the process. Obviously, we're starting it today, but if they don't buy into it, then the next administration, the next council may bend to their political will or complaints and say, okay, we'll stop again. So how can you put this together so it just moves forward without that kind of interruption?
Okay, let me ask you this question, because this hodgepodge effect is, do you want to place that burden on people that have moved into a subdivision that don't have sidewalks that are going to pay for this?
Because of a decision made 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Those are
No,
good
those are the
questions.
kind of
Right.
hurdles that I think that you have to sort of ask yourself as you move forward and you start to really drill down on this issue. And I think those are the kind of things that Mr. Uresti was really formulating in his letter from 2021. And I don't have an answer for you, but I guess my question would be, what do you want your community to look like? What do you want this community to look like in the next 20 years? And I want to get involved, before you answer that, I want to get involved in some good discussions on the next segment of this, which is active transportation.
I think there's a survey out there right now that people could take to answer a few of those
Yes,
questions.
yes, sir.
Spot on.
Yep.
Good point.
Yeah.
Mr. Resty?
Yeah, so two things. I think when we look at where our priorities lie, I think the main thing that comes in is safety. And I think that's when we address homeowners of something that needs to be done, we deal with it with the context that it's a safety issue. If it's our safety issue because of trees, that's why we put in $50,000 that we're doing some projects that is the city's responsibility. We're paying for those things. If it's just a broken up sidewalk, something that basically needs to be maintained, and it's a great health hazard because it's an area that's traveled by a lot of people, that's a safety issue that needs to be addressed. And those are where our priorities lie in on when we have to address the community, and we've done it. We've done it in the nuisances, and we've done it in other issues.
Sure.
A city can't be scared to basically, and I'm not saying we are, but a city can't be afraid, or a council can't be afraid to basically say that's something that needs to be fixed. And I think on that premise, that's kind of like where we're at with this whole sidewalk project. The other thing also is, again, we're talking about something that's huge. And I can say I've addressed it. And last time when I wrote, I talked about something that needs to be done. Two parts. One, whether the city puts together the master sidewalk plan, because we understand the sidewalk systems, or whether we hire somebody from the outside and then basically have that individual look at it and say, this is in comparison to what other communities do, and this is where our priorities should start, and this is how we should basically address and go from there on it. And then city council and the administration, we can finesse that on how it basically can work. But somebody has to write the plan, like we did with our first initial, and I said this before, our 50,000 strategic plan that we did back in the when I first came on council, you know,
Yeah.
in the 90s. 2000, I'm sorry, 2000, sorry.
It seems like the 90s,
Yeah, I'm
right?
going too far. But in 2003, when we put together our strategic plan, it cost us $50,000 at that time. That was huge, big money. And I mean, it addressed a lot of things. And this might be what that takes place with our, whoever puts together the master plan. You know, we would tie up our engineering department, our city, to basically, with many of the projects that need to be done if they had to do it themselves. So it might be one of those things where we might want to go outside to basically address this issue. So anyways.
Mr. Engel?
Yeah, I have a couple things. First, I think we need to try to enforce what we have now to what we need to get, what the city's responsibility is to fix. I think we need to do that before we go any place else. Then I also, like what Mr. Mast was saying, I think we need to try to have somebody come in, do something to rewrite this and enforce it, or do what we have now and enforce what we got. Because if we never enforce it, we're sitting here for 2 hours, 3 hours, and nothing's gonna get, we're gonna be right where we're at now. I think we need to start to enforce it. The city needs to fix what is their responsibility before we go any further and do it that way. I mean, that's my opinion there.
Mrs. Critch?
I like what Joe was saying as far as the safety part. And I think maybe if we propose that as a big safety issue with Carpenter Road, and Stadium Drive being able to get to point A to point B and making it safe. I remember the meeting that we had at the church off of Ayersville Avenue with the East Side community, when we were talking about, revitalization, what would you like to see, the number one answer those people said was sidewalks. We gave them a playground, we gave them, other things, but they wanted sidewalks. And I think of going from point A, the Ottawa Avenue is a perfect example to see those sidewalks for those people, but in their neighborhoods, there are no sidewalks in those neighborhoods, but for them to go from Ayersville Avenue to across Ottawa Avenue to go to the playground, there's no sidewalks. They're walking on the streets and there are children everywhere. So I think if we think of it as a safety issue and propose it that way, maybe we would see people backing it up a little bit more. That's my idea.
That's a good idea. And actually, if you really want to know where we should be looking at strategic areas, Ottawa Avenue, Ayersville Avenue would be two good places that you could really look at. And what better way to create the kind of infrastructure to get people off the street, right? And to give those pedestrian users the kind of infrastructure that provides a safe means of transportation.
And you see those people using it all the time
Sure.
now, going to Dollar General, they're walking on
Absolutely.
that sidewalk,
Yeah.
because there is no grocery store over in that area for them to walk to. They can walk right
Not
to
even
Dollar
sure
General.
I would ride a bike on Ayersville Avenue. The way it's crowned and everything, it's tough.
So, yeah, I think safety is a big issue if we propose it that way.
Mr. Waxler.
Yeah, that was what she was speaking on, was what I was gonna bring up, with all that money into them parks over there. We put a lot of money into parks, which I'm not against. But we don't make it so people can get to the parks.
Sure.
We did all that money on the east side. The park's beautiful, but I think we should have worried about getting them to the park and then worried about putting the
Well-
1,000 where we did in the park.
We're worried about getting them to the park, okay? I can
Well,
tell you
obviously
that.
not, we'd made sidewalks that area first, then we did on the park.
Well,
They did
but
that.
we have sidewalk program that's gonna go into that area that will be paid for through grant funds.
My point is.
I know, you wanna have the grant funds and you wanna build the infrastructure before the park.
Exactly.
I
That
get
was
it.
my point.
I get
My
it.
point is, we spent a lot of money on stuff in parks and all the playground, a lot of money in parks and walking areas.
Sure.
But we gotta be able to get it. I think we need to focus more on the safety part, then worry about the activity part. And that's not what we do or have done in the past.
Well, point well taken.
I think a lot of that though stems from a lot of that's opportunistic.
It is.
spending. With
It's opportunities.
grant Money comes available, you have to take it, so.
So, with,
Can I just add?
yeah,
I wasn't gonna say anything all the way, but I'm having a hard time containing myself. To Mr. Corbett's point and to Mr. Engel's points, a couple things you gentlemen both said. Whether this language is 40 years old or not, it's pretty good language. Gives you flexibility to do a lot of things, and it addresses the real issues you want to deal with: maintenance, snow.
right.
The flaw, and it'll be the flaw in new language. It'll be the flaw in no matter what we pay to come up with a new code.
Yes.
The flaw is going to be the will to enforce
Exactly.
it. You
That's-
have the will to enforce this language. You can do anything you want.
There's nothing wrong with this plan you got wrote, the ordinance you have. You followed it and pushed it.
No,
Right.
Every new development, every assessment is gonna come before you as a resolution of necessity and an ordinance approving that assessment. And you may get angry calls from your constituents and start, and we understand, you'll start to question the value of the sidewalk. But you have that flexibility as elected officials.
Right, and that's what I was saying. I understand what Joe's saying, but I don't agree with spending money to have somebody come in and tell us what to do or write a new ordinances when we have it. We just don't enforce what we have.
you have the will, right, it's the will, right? I mean, that's what it is. But I'm gonna tell you something, as the city administrator here for a long time, in looking at the past years, okay? I'm not gonna apologize for anything that we didn't enforce in terms of sidewalks, because placing the burden of that during the last 10 years, whether it's financial hardship, whether it's a pandemic, whatever it is, I think you have it there. I think what you have to do is find the balance to it. We've gone in and we've repaired sidewalks and we've done things. We've even made people repair their own sidewalks, okay, when it was complaint driven. So I think you have it on the books, okay? And I would be the first one to say, okay, everybody, let's enforce it and let's stick to our guns and let's go forward and let's make sure that we're gonna move forward and we're not gonna deviate. Do we have the capacity to do that? Does the legislative body, does the administration have the capacity to do that? And are they willing to do that, and do they have the will to do that? You might. But guess what? When you start getting the calls and when you start to get, what are you guys doing to me? Those kind of questions, and how long is this gonna go on? And then where else are you gonna put new sidewalks? And are you going to assess those people as well? Because you can and you have the right to. Are you going to? And are you going to be consistent with the way you deliver and you enact and you follow this code? Because I got a news flash. Guess what? You didn't assess the people at South Clinton Street, and you have a good reason for it. I mean, I'm not going to go into that. But you're going to have other areas of this town and that, you know what, people are going to say, why are you doing this to me and you're not doing it to them? And it goes back to this hodgepodge. Why didn't you make those people in Huffman Edition or Kettering or Paulview Drive put sidewalks in and you made me do it? And I want to get into that discussion next because I want to get into some active transportation concepts, so.
Mr. Esty?
Yeah. Back in 2012, 2013, we had former Councilman Plant that brought up the sidewalk issues, probably for about half a year, something on that line.
It was the better part of 2 years.
Okay, half a year, no, I'm sorry.
We had a 5-year plan, a
Yeah.
20-year plan to do it.
So, you know, it's like a two-year conversation.
I can even cite you the city that he was at, that he's talking about, that had him if you want.
Yeah. So we talked about the issue for about 2 years.
Yeah.
And the big thing is, I think out of it, we started to enforce new buildings, new homes and industry or whatever that mandated sidewalks.
Sure.
We brought up once upon a time the sidewalk that went to nowhere, but it needed to be put there because in essence it was a new building or whatever.
Yeah.
And also the disability issue, you know, where it just can't say that one size fits all. Basically, it has to fit everybody. So, you know, that's the next issue that when we say, why are we doing these types of things? And that's another part, is basically to accommodate those who need travel and they have this difficulty traveling from point A to point B. You know, how we do it, we could do it. The question on it is where do we start? You know, in our community. So anyways, I just thought I'd throw that in.
Well, you're right. I mean, when you start to ask that question, especially about wheelchairs, you know, there was a very good resource in a gentleman by the name of Greg Ruggles, who would constantly visit us, and we would get great input from him. And if you want to know one of the things that changed in terms of a pedestrian walkway, go out to south of town here, go on Downs and Clinton Street, and you will see that in crossing that roadway, that it's sort of like you stop, there's an island there, and then you can go on. And the reason you see that is because it's such a long stretch of roadway, and the lights and the way they need to be synchronized and those kind of things were concepts that as we had discussions with him, we got a perspective of what it feels like to be in a wheelchair and some of the challenges. And I mean, those are big issues, and those are things that we should address. Now, we should be sensitive to those things, almost more so than we do worrying about, you know, who puts a sidewalk in or repairing a sidewalk. They need sidewalks and they need to be mobile. So with that.
Oh, Mr. Engel?
Oh.
Yep. I think one thing we need to really try to figure out, who's gonna pay for this? I mean, are we gonna?
You have a code section right now that says the property owner.
Where are we gonna start at?
You say that the property owner's gonna pay for it. And the question is that what you wanna do with, yeah.
In what direction we're gonna go with it?
And, oh, go ahead.
One other, sorry. Like Mr. Mack said, when we look at focusing on what points, what areas we're gonna focus on, I feel like Mrs. Crutch, we also discussed as far as the safety, the main traffic areas, I think need the attention. I really do. Like South Clinton, that's main traffic. You have Ralston coming in, you have Ayersville Avenue. You know, those areas is where we have the most heavily populated traffic.
Sure.
And I agree with Mr. Waxler as well. We build a park, we have a splash pad, lots of activity. We need to allow our citizens to get there. But I think the priority is the traffic and the safety.
Mrs. Crutch?
When you talk about sensitivity of the people that have special needs to get to one place or the other, we also have to think of sensitivity of the people that purchased homes in areas without sidewalks because that's what they wanted, is they didn't want to have sidewalks, personally. You know, so I think of some of the areas, Wooded Acres and Kettering, you know, they didn't want sidewalks.
Right.
So we have to be sensitive to those people who.
I wouldn't put sidewalks in subdivisions that we've already made decisions on to not have sidewalks. I don't think that we should touch those.
Right, just the places that.
Right, that's the focus. So maybe it's the focus points, right, and what we need to do. And when you start to talk about ways to pay for it, or are you gonna put it on those property owners? They made a decision to move there, live there, right? What do you wanna do? Do you wanna step up the enforcement on it, or do you wanna give them alleviate some of the burden, financial burden? Those are the kind of questions.
That's a good point, like everything else.
Yeah.
Anyways, one of the points that I made in the statement that I sent out to everybody was, what if a neighborhood, like up north side of town or whatever, what if the entire street wanted to put in sidewalks? How do we address that and make it economical for them to be able to do something that's very costly like that? You know, that would be a game plan if you had a community or a neighborhood that came to us and asked us, how can we make this happen that basically would work for everybody? So
sure. It's
in our neighborhood. You know, how would we address that issue? When we talk about what Mr. Engel says, who pays for it? So anyways, that's what I'd say.
And one more comment before you head on to your next point.
Okay.
Because I keep stalling you out.
No, it's okay. I told you that this was, I knew this would be a long discussion.
For them, I think if it's a safety issue and it's on their property, they need to pay for it. That's my opinion. If it's something that we created, we need to pay for it.
Correct.
But I also think that we need to have something, there's some people out there living on a budget that don't have the money to do that. I think we need to have some kind of a plan not to pay for it, or maybe pay for it and they pay us back. We need to have something that we can work with the public, that they can, I'm not gonna say excess their taxes and jack their taxes and all that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying we have to have some kind of a program that we can financially help them and then they pay it back somehow. I don't know how that works. That's John's problem. But,
We'll understand.
yeah,
Well, in fact, the way we pay for something and allow people to pay us back is the assessment, property tax
yeah.
assessment.
But I think we have a way to do that for people that truly can't afford it. I'm not talking people just say, I don't have the money. We know that. I mean, they're gonna have those people too. We all understand that.
Yeah.
So I think if we're gonna do it, we gotta do it. And it don't matter if they got paid for it or not. If it's on their property and they can afford it, they pay for it. As far as what Joe said, if I was gonna do it, and my whole neighborhood wanted to do it, we'd all pay for our own and do it, because once you bring the city in, then you got all these prevailing wages and this, and then everything triples, and, you can hire a contractor and do your sidewalk really cheap. I've done all mine, but
Right.
I don't have to follow the city code and do all that. So, I mean,
Right.
not code, but the
Yeah,
wages.
sure.
So, I mean, there's cheaper ways of doing it.
Yes.
Than having the city do it, a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
So,
Mr. Engel.
I think, Jeff, I think you'll remember that, maybe Joe does it. Nobody else was probably on council at the time, but when I first came on council, I was on streets and sidewalks, and I think we made it to where new subdivisions were going to have sidewalks. If I'm not mistaken, the ones like where,
Well, that might be true, but what new subdivision have we had?
no, I'm just saying that when we do that if we
Yeah.
ever have a subdivision, that brings a point up to where the apartments are going to be at. Are they gonna have to be required for sidewalks of any kind?
Yes, every residential subdivision in our current planning and zoning code must have sidewalks on both sides of the street.
Okay.
If it's a commercial, industrial, retail subdivision, then they only have to have it on one side of the street. The only exception to that, Mr. Engel, is if the developer were to go to planning commission and ask for a variance and say, yes, I'm spending millions of dollars on this subdivision, but I can't afford the $20,000 to put the sidewalk in. So, I mean, they do make that argument, and sometimes planning commission grants the variance, but it would take a lot of steel and a lot of effort to withstand that pressure.
There's probably a way that they can add that into their prices or whatever too.
Correct.
But anyhow, but I know we hadn't had any subdivision, but I know when we did that, that was one thing that was gonna have
Sure.
to be done.
Next slide, please.
Next slide.
I'm sorry. I wasn't
There we go.
sleeping, I was thinking ahead.
I think if you look at the future and where certainly I think the city is going is it's trending more toward what is considered to be active transportation. Active transportation in this slide is defined as human-powered transportation that engages people in healthy physical activity while they travel from place to place. A number of years ago, I actually had gone with a group of citizens to Washington, D.C. to a program that was called Activate America. And it dealt with the obesity rate in the United States. And I think that if you look at really what is being promoted, it's just getting people to move and active and making them very active so they can we're getting too many people that are obviously having some issues with obesity. The whole point is we want these people to engage in what we call active transportation, biking, walking, and the question is as we move forward into the future, what is it that we want to promote? I know we have sidewalks. I know we have a sidewalk code. Where do we want this community to go in the next 20 years? What do you see it? And I think it's really important to understand one thing, okay? Because as we go through, we're going through a process right now with our comprehensive plan. And Josh, when you're talking about those surveys being sent out, we're going through some interesting planning in terms of where this community needs to go and where it'll go in the next 30 years, 20 to 30 years, okay? But active transportation and that mode of transportation, biking and those kind of things, are going to be important. They may not be important to us, okay? They're gonna be important to younger people, okay? They're much more important to younger people. Could you go to the next slide? 5 goals developed in active transportation. Let's increase the connections between place for non-motorized means of travel. What that means is we need to provide these connections. We talked about connections of Carpenter Road. We talked about these connections of Stadium Drive. We talked about these destination places. You talked about having, maybe we should have built the sidewalk before we put people in the park. Good point, right? But you have to build the infrastructure and the connectivity piece to get them from point A to point B. Should we have sidewalks down Latchall Drive? You have places, you have people that are actually walking on the street because they want to go for an evening walk, and you have people that are actually walking in the street. Do you want to have that connectivity where you're connecting Latchall Drive into some other form of infrastructure? And I think you do. Safety. We talk about South Clinton Street and what we're doing on South Clinton Street and the sidewalks and the decisions that we've made to, you know what, we're going to move forward and getting these kids off the right of way. And we're going to move them back, and we're going to create the kind of infrastructure that if somebody wants to go to the splash park or the school or just south of town, then we're going to make sure that they're going to do it safely. And obviously, the accessibility and health and those kind of things are important concepts of active transportation. We used to be what was called free range kids. You used to walk out at night, and you might be barefoot, and you might have to be home when the street lights were on, but you were going to be gone all day and most of the evening, and you're going to come back when you had to come back. You don't see free range kids anymore. And that's part of the problem that you're seeing today. Those free range kids used to be very active, and they created their own kind of entertainment, whether they put a baseball card or a card in their spoke of their bike and listened to it, or whatever they did. That's what they did when we were younger. And I think that what we're trying to promote is we don't need to be putting cards in spikes of our bicycles, but what you do need to create is the kind of infrastructure that if a young mother wants to take a stroller out and walk her baby down someplace and be safe about it, that she has the infrastructure to do so. And those are the kind of important concepts. That's why I say, what do you want to promote in terms of transportation and the kind of infrastructure, and what is it where do we need to go as a community to put these issues in front of us and move forward with these items? And I think what I would tell you is, darn right, we need to put that infrastructure in. That's exactly what this community should be doing. And when you look at the makeup and the natural assets that this community has, you better take advantage of them, and there's ways to do that. And those are the things that we ought to be pushing forward on. Next slide, please. Trails. And it's interesting because there's a number of trails, and I gotta tell you that the one guy that we've got that knows a lot about trails is Ryan Mack, okay? So go ahead.
Not more than Councilwoman.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm pretty impressed with some of the, so you do a lot of hiking and you've seen a lot, so I think.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So the goal of the next few slides, I guess, is to demonstrate to you that active transportation, which Jeff has talked about several times tonight, is not just hearkening back to yesteryear and baseball cards, the spokes of bikes. It's not just something in the distant future that we should be working towards. It's something that, thanks to people like our city engineer, our city planner, and even our MS4 coordinator, we've already been working towards as a city. And so the next few slides are going to demonstrate some of those things and look at areas that we can work to focus more on. The Reservoir Trail. Anybody, we brought up the splash pad, we brought up a couple different parks. One of the has to be top 5 things we get complimented on as a city is the Reservoir Trail. Whether it's the boardwalk, the reservoir itself, it has enhanced the community around it. It is something that has become a gem to the city of Defiance. And there are sidewalks leading to it. It has a whole transportation process to it. It's a great example of active transportation. It's hiking, it's walking, it gets you to that point where you can do that exercise. There's a dog park, there's a sledding hill, those types of amenities. It's a perfect all-in-one package. Next slide. Buckeye Trail. So the Buckeye Trail is 1,444 miles around the state of Ohio. It is one of the larger circuit trails in the entire country that's just self-contained in one state. It happens to flow right through downtown Defiance, right through our sidewalks, right up to that Reservoir Trail, which actually several people in the city are trying to get that carved out into the Buckeye Trail to make it an actual certified section of it. It's a very important trail, grows around the state of Ohio. It plays a large part through the downtown on our sidewalks, which is why sidewalk maintenance, improving these sidewalks should be and is an important goal for us as a city. We just got some new trail signage installed. One is at Pontiac Park, the other is at the Reservoir. This highlights the Buckeye Trail and the North Country Trail, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes. There's also some smaller signage that's going to be going up all around town to highlight these trails, these state trails, these national trails that flow right through our downtown on our sidewalks. Next one. This is an up close of the one side of the large sign. Again, it shows the map through our downtown, shows the whole Buckeye Trail and a little bit of the North Country. This is the opposite side, talks about the historical importance of our downtown. Talks about, again, a map through the city of Defiance and where that stuff hits. These are great for bringing people into our community if we focus on them. If we make sure, we are improving our sidewalks, we are improving expanded shoulders, like are done on along the Maumee River on River Road. These are important things. These signs actually that were created, we were contacted by the Buckeye Trail and asked, they're so good if they can be used as a standard for the state of Ohio for Buckeye Trail signs. So we are putting the work in to bring people towards active transportation, towards our downtown, towards actually the whole city. And these are some of the signs that are going to bring us to that. Go to the next one. A little bit out of left field when we're having a sidewalk discussion, but the Maumee River itself, by order of the state of Ohio, is technically a river trail designated by the state of Ohio a few years ago. The map you're looking at are all points of access for canoeing and kayaking from Lake Erie all the way to the state line. We actually had a couple of our firefighters, I want to say 2 years ago, that completed this in like three days. I mean, just nonstop kayaking from Fort Wayne up to Lake Erie. Next slide. If you see these signs out and about as you're driving past Pontiac, these are the indicators for those boat ramps. Again, I know in a sidewalk discussion, it's a little bit out of left field, but it all gets into active transportation. It all gets into us bringing people towards these locations for better exercise. North Country Trail, again, see the signs up in the top left corner. You will see those going up around town. The North Country Trail is actually a trail that flows through 8 states, thousands of miles, 4,800 miles, actually longer than the Appalachian Trail, flows along the Buckeye Trail corridor through the city of Defiance. Again, this is a national trail, a federally preserved trail that runs on the sidewalks of the city of Defiance. So just tying it back together on why we need to focus on those things. So, I'm gonna take off future projects.
Sure. Actually, you have a map behind you. It might be easier to see. But look, I think that if you look at future improvements and future infrastructure that we're really taking a serious look at. And again, I think that if you look overall at some of the improvements that we've made, there's been significant improvements with infrastructure in our community. I mean, do we have challenges before us, and do we need to, be aggressive? Yes, we have to keep up with that. But I think that if you consider what's on the, sort of on the chalkboard right now and some of the things that we're looking at, there's no question that you'll see improvements. For example, on Ginner Road, we have secured a grant for a shared use path that will actually tie in from State Route 66. It'll go all the way down to, I'm not quite sure of the property, but it'll go south to the property where people don't have to walk on Ginner Road. They can walk on a shared use path. Eventually, if we can entertain some cooperation from the Boy Scout camp, it could tie into that. I know that there's been some issues there, but once again, you're giving people the opportunity to walk and be part of using some infrastructure that is promoting, again, good health, pedestrian active transportation. And anytime you're looking at some of these concepts here, those are the kind of things that we're trying to promote. We have plans to finish off the sidewalk on Carnes Avenue, which will take it all the way to Cleveland. You know, we have grant money that was secured for the park, the pathway, and some of the sidewalks down Carnes. We are in the process of trying to secure more money to finish that off as well. So again, sometimes we're at the mercy of grant dollars, and it takes a bit longer to get there than we want. But nonetheless, what we're trying to do is trying to create those infrastructure improvements to get from point A to point B. And that'll tie in nicely with some of the new shared use paths down Cleveland Avenue. So connecting, those connecting points is what we talked about. Once again, is connecting certain areas of our town and moving forward. Ottawa Avenue, one of the things that we are certainly looking at Ottawa Avenue is finishing off sidewalks and finishing them off from East 2nd Street all the way out to the roundabout. And again, we're at the mercy of grant dollars, but nonetheless, it takes us longer to get there. But some of the things that we have on the sort of the drawing board is making those connections, making and connecting point A to point B, and getting people off the roadway so they can walk it or bike it or do whatever they need to do, but safe modes of travel. Kingsbury Park playground improvements. We've got, obviously, we're doing some things in that regard. We have some downtown active transportation improvements that we've talked about. And let me say this, okay? Because I think that, you know, we have had things on the drawing board where sometimes they get shot down, okay? And I'll be just honest with you. I mean, I think for the most part, we called it a road diet and people flipped out and they, you know, didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I'm gonna just speak about it, okay? It is something that you must look at if you want a viable downtown. And if you want to reduce the truck traffic, if you want to reduce the noise, and if you want to create better opportunities for businesses in the downtown area, it's something that you should really look at and entertain. Because it is really pushing the issues of what I think, and I hope that you think this community should be about, and it's just creating active transportation with pedestrians, and I think we need to move forward on it. I think it's a good plan. And I think it's a good plan, especially when you consider the natural assets that we have here. You know, Commerce Drive sidewalk improvements, that's on our schedule. But look, I think that, you know what, could be pie in the sky. It's something I know you've heard about, we've talked about. We talk about it internally all the time. It's the Tridge. It's something that, you know what, if you're not gonna think big about this community, then I guess, then forget it. Having big dreams and big plans is not a bad thing. and actually putting a three-way pedestrian bridge across the confluence of two rivers will put this place on the map. Not just in Ohio, but I'm talking about nationwide. You just have to have the will to do it. And you have to build the consensus and the collaboration to do it. It's something that can be done. And I know that we have the tendency to like float the idea out there, right? And then we get some real backlash from it. And it's like, what are these people thinking? Well, let's stop thinking that way and let's start building collaboration with partners to get things done. That's what you have to do in this sidewalk program. I think that that's what you're really talking about is building the kind of collaboration, the partnerships to move it forward and to move the community forward. That's what it takes. It doesn't take one like city administrator to sit in a chair and say, by gosh, we're going to assess those people and move forward. It takes a legislative body and an administration to do it. And I think those are the kind of things that we're promoting. With that, I don't have anything else that I really want to talk about. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer anything.
Mr. Esty.
So what's next?
Well,
if all of a sudden we talk about sidewalks, the city, about accessibility, about everything we just talked about just now, what's next?
Well, let me ask you the question with a question.
Yeah.
Okay. I am telling you, as I sit here, you have people that are on our staff that will be more than happy to tell you where they think we should go, and they're excited about it. And whether it's sidewalks or active transportation, these people have been. These people are saying, I mean, why aren't we doing these things and why aren't we moving it forward? To me, the sidewalk issue, tonight we talked about sidewalks and enforcement. I think that's just a small piece of it. Right. I think the active transportation and where you want to go with infrastructure and what you want it to be, I think is important. I think what we're working on in terms of what's next is through a comprehensive plan.
A long time ago, and I always keep referring to before I lost my election back in 2013, that's a long time ago for me. Anyways, back then, what you used to do at that time, I think Mr. Engel probably remembers this also, is basically you said, okay, these are 8 items that I think are important for our community. I think it was 8 items. In what priority do you want to start with any of those eight projects? So in essence, what you do is you asked us to let you know, or I don't know what we did in discussion or whatever, what was the starting point of 1, 2, 3 on down the line. And I think you had some good items, which in essence we've addressed many times in a lot of our legislations that we've done on council. But I think that's a good starting point. I mean, if you look at what are some of the things you talked about or some whatever, at least you'll get the thoughts of where council's at. And at that point, how does the administration think about it? And how does the staff think about it? So in essence, now we start to blend our consensus into maybe something a starting point. But we have to have something. That's why I said, what's next? You know, whether you do it, whether we do it, or we do it as a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, somebody's going to have to say, let's start here.
I think that's a great suggestion.
That's my thoughts.
Thank you.
Mr. Mast?
Just for me, one of the final things to take away from this, I think, is that the idea of active transportation and shared use paths seems to be relatively new in Defiance, but there are plenty of places across the nation where they're fully entrenched in that sort of thing. And I think once we can get it built and get it in place, it'll gain a continuity that'll benefit future citizens of Defiance greatly. It's not something that's gonna go away, I don't think. I think it's important to invest in it because people will use it and they will continue to use it down the line. We just have to figure out how to do it.
Mr. Waxler?
I guess in my eyes, the starting point that I have right now is getting the sidewalks and stuff out there that are in need, that we already know need repaired.
Sure.
Repaired, that's where we need to start.
Sure.
Start addressing them and follow the ordinance and do what we're supposed to do. That's the starting point. I mean, to me, because that's part of the safety issue. So.
You know, I think,
And now, does that take somebody that's gotta go out there and walk the city? I don't know. I don't know what that is.
it's gonna
I know we used
require,
to do that.
it's gonna require some engineering.
I mean, we used to do that. We used to have somebody went around and then they come back with this plan.
Yeah.
This sidewalks or the work, you know, we had pictures. I remember doing that.
Sure.
And that's what but we never followed through with it. We just stopped. And that's what we can't do.
That is in our code, as is the sidewalk improvement zones that Mr. Mack mentioned, 905.16.
That's what I'm saying. Let's go follow our code and
The
start
question
there.
is, if she does that,
Okay.
if the city engineer does that,
Okay.
will she have the support from the legislative body? I think is the ultimate question.
Well, I'm sorry, what?
If she does that, identifies the areas that need to be repaired for safety issues or whatever.
If they're
Will
safety
she have
issues,
your
they gotta be repaired. That's, I can't believe anybody in this council would not say that if it's safety, let's repair it.
That has not been the case in the past, and that's part of why I think it's
I mean, I get a lot of phone calls, people would tell me they can't walk because of the sidewalks.
Everyone would say, yeah, let's repair it. Next question is, well, you said it 50 times, at whose expense? We follow the code, it's at the property owner's expense.
And I said, we gotta start following the code and go by the ordinance, unless it's something that our trees or whatever created, or something that the city has created.
Right.
Then we address it differently. But there again, I also said, I think we need to have some kind of a plan to help the ones that can't, and I don't know what that is. Somebody's gotta tell me that. What do you do to help the people that can't do it?
Assessment.
I mean, you know.
I mean, that's what and then again, in my memo to everybody, is one of the issues that I addressed, and I think, John, you could answer this better than anybody else, is whether we have areas where somebody needs to repair something but just basically can't afford it. So what kind of...
Well, something the city's not very good at, and we try to avoid because we're not very good at it, is means testing. We're not good at telling you can't afford it, and you can't afford it. We're gonna help you, we're not gonna, it's part of what they do. Maybe we need to reach out to those kind of.
But maybe some people say I can't afford it at that point, then you just tell them, okay, then we're gonna have to do an assessment or this or that. That's what we gotta do. We gotta come up with that plan to do that. We gotta do it.
Can you do an assessment to a property that has maybe a $3,000 sidewalk improvement that they have to make because of safety reasons? What can the city do to help somebody like that basically can't afford it? I'm just saying.
So the way this has been done in a lot of other cities would be, you have an annual program, not unlike our resurfacing program. We prioritize streets that get flagged as needing repair, busted, stub toes, whatever it is. And you give the property owners the opportunity, you give them an advance notice that maybe even of the prior year, but you give them advance notice that they're on the schedule for next summer to be repaired. Or, and they have the option, they can repair it themselves. They can get it repaired themselves, they can pay their own contractor.
Which is a lot cheaper.
And they've got X amount of time to do that. Maybe from May 1st, they have till July 1st to get it done. After July 1st, we're gonna have a contractor that the city hires or crews that the city brings out. We're gonna replace them. And at that cost is then gonna be assessed. Sidewalks are typically assessed for 5 years. You might be able to go out to 10. But say a 5-year assessment on a $2,000 repair, and it would go on the property taxes. Whether it's a rental property, it goes to the owner. If it's an owner occupied, it goes, you know.
That's what I was talking about. Basically what it amounts to is what can be done. And I think we talked about, this conversation here tonight that, what if the person can't afford it? What about this? What about that? Well, they might not be able to afford it now, but can they be able to afford it over a period of time?
Yeah.
Where the city can give them that time, where in essence it's small bites versus a large bite and basically doing the project.
Right.
That makes it a little bit more acceptable to some people, because in essence, what they can look at said, the city's working with me to try to get something that's done. It's gonna improve his property once it's done.
Exactly.
So there's improvement there. So that it works two ways, but I think that has to be part of our game plan, I guess.
And that's all I was just gonna say, it increases their value.
Yeah.
The property value goes up. I mean, yeah, we're gonna assess them for 5 years to whatever that is, but their property value also goes up because it's got a nice sidewalk.
Got it. But it will require you, before we even send a letter out to the property owner, to pass a resolution of necessity and identify the areas to be improved and the estimate, the engineer's best estimate amount of the improvement. You'll have to give them notice to fix it themselves first, as Mr. Leonard stated, and then you have to give them not less than 30 days, and that's in 72902, to fix it before you can go on and undertake the improvement.
But I just think we're talking safety here, so.
Yeah.
That's good.
I mean, it is what it is.
That's good.
As several members of council have pointed out, I think, as we discuss this and move this forward, let's start dropping the hammer on some of these. Are we gonna look at areas? Are we gonna look at what areas are we gonna focus on? The thing that has been brought up from several council members, which I think is reassuring, is the partnership on that. And I think from the administration side, we just wanna make sure that there is a partnership. And as Sean just said, part of it is bringing legislation to you to approve. But I think even before that, if we look at the code, there are some sections that talk about that dividing up into different categorical areas of the city. I think that would be something we would be more comfortable bringing to council as well.
Right.
As we look at, okay, the engineer has looked at these different areas. This is the area we're planning on focusing on next year. Is council in favor of that? Is that something that you are in favor of? You guys can go out and take a look at those properties, take a look at those sidewalks, and help us in a collaborative effort to decide what we're gonna do.
I think what's important, no matter what we do, we got four wards in our community. As long as, like other communities, they're fair, they go from one ward to another and spread the money. Now, if all we're doing is concentrating in one area, then that doesn't benefit the community as a whole.
I hear you on that.
And that would be something of during budgets or whatever, when we sit down and we talk, and I think you guys do a good job when you present it to us, that they say, okay, and we can see it. We can see those streets, we can see what's going on, and then we have a chance to basically address it at that point. But I think you guys have been fair in our streets improvements, and I think you probably would be the same thing with sidewalk improvements if we did something like on that line. But that's good.
The other thing I was saying, and the first thing we're gonna hear, I can tell you right now, is people are gonna say, you called South Pleasant Street a safety issue. You paid for it. That's what we're gonna hear. Because we're saying you're gonna fix your sidewalk because it's safety. But then they're gonna say, well, that's what you did out there and you paid for it. But, we're just gonna have to be on, and tell them, we're that out there was something that the city created. We allowed that street to be widened.
Well-
We allowed them sidewalks to be covered over the years. We did, Sean. The sidewalks were a lot wider. So that's a totally different animal, I would call it, than what we're gonna face with just telling you to fix your sidewalk because it's broke. So that's just something we all need to be on the same page of reason why that was paid for versus.
Well, and our code gives you that authority to
Right.
say, well, this area, we think we should pay for it. These safety issues in these areas, in these wards, we think.
That we could also give names out to these people of other companies that's what I wondered, if we couldn't recommend them. Gotcha.
Yeah, but if they call already and they're constable will know all the different contractors.
Oh, that's
My
true,
opinion,
too.
I know who I'd call, I know several I'd call. So.
Right, because I remember, we had Helen do our sidewalk, whatever.
But back when they did that in the 80s, I had to replace my sidewalks on Riverside, and that was at my cost, but the city come and said, you gotta do it.
Right.
It was at my cost.
I had to do mine too.
Yeah.
Can we get some sort of idea of what it was gonna take through the engineering department to identify problem areas and what a constructive plan would be to go in and make improvements? I mean, is that something that we're gonna do internally, or is that something that's gonna have to be?
That's something that I would go to the staff, the engineering staff to work with to give you that. We can do that.
Get an idea together.
We can do that. We can look at areas, target areas, things like that, maybe how we would look at zones and things like that.
And secondly, I just wanna say, I hope we didn't just spend an hour and a half to decide we're just gonna keep our code and just enforce what we've got, because we already had it there and we probably could have done that a little quicker.
Well, I think the whole point of being, pushing out the active transportation is, that's where most communities are going. I mean, that really is. I mean, I think that it's something that you should consider and look at and be aware of. And I think for the most part, as we move forward, I think it will define the community in the next 20 years. I think it's the kind of infrastructure that can be used by young, old, whoever wants to use it. But nonetheless, it's active, it's human beings that are going to be providing that mode of transportation, and it's the thing that we should be promoting. Hard to do that when you have busted up sidewalks, right? Right. So
It's
I
a
think,
it's a two-pronged fork.
yeah,
One is the repair, and the assessments, and of the existing, and one is the active. And we have plans for active. We've done a lot of active already.
Absolutely.
Carnes Avenue, East High Street,
Right.
Ottawa Avenue. There's more to come. That's well underway.
Yeah.
We're basically paying for it,
Yeah.
grants and whatever else. And then you got the other prong, which is what we're talking about over here.
Well, if we don't dream for that, then our city's never gonna grow and do anything. I mean,
yeah,
you go
but
to
I
all the
also
other
think, look,
communities,
I mean,
they have
I
this.
think, I understand where you're coming from when you say, let's enforce it. But let's also look at new concepts, and let's not just, that code was built and put there in the 80s. This is 40 years later. Let's look at new concepts as well, and we can push those forward as well.
Mr. Esty?
Good discussion. It's not gonna be solved overnight. I think it's gonna probably revolve around budget, what monies are available, in time. And, I think if we, let you guys work on it, and then a timeline like maybe October, right before budget sits in November. That's when we, probably an October date, where you guys can, if not before, but at least give you enough time to basically put together a game plan of what we talked about here today.
Yeah.
And then assessments of where you think, priorities we might want to do in our priorities, and a game plan, dealing with other communities, what they're doing, so on and so forth, in the master plans. But maybe we can come back together as a whole in October, if it's okay with council, and maybe re-talk about this again, see where we're at, and then go from there.
I think John's right about the two-pronged approach. It is about the code enforcement. It is about active transportation concepts. And those are the two things that we should be moving forward with.
If I recall, last year we had, prior to the budget meeting, we had a meeting, I think specifically on resurfacing. We could
did.
certainly do resurfacing and sidewalks and a shared meeting prior to the real budget meeting.
That's a good timeline, worked out pretty good.
And Mr. Hancock?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, as Mr. Mast had mentioned as well, will that give engineering enough time to formulate some information as well?
I don't know.
Mr. O'Donnell?
I wanna try to preempt the email that we're gonna get from Mr. Gray on how the Americans with Disabilities Act does not allow us to assess for sidewalks. He and I view that federal statute differently, but I do appreciate the cases that he sends my way. And overall, I think we agree that we should have a community that's accessible for everyone, with whatever means of transportation they use or whatever disabilities they may have. So
Absolutely.
you're probably gonna get an email, but we're just gonna have to agree to disagree.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Plain, Reverend Plain,
Sean, do I need to come up?
please do.
Dave Plant, 321 Maywin. And I guess I just want to encourage you. I just want to remind you this was the exact same conversation we had my last year on council. This is the exact same conversation we had in 2012. And Mr. Lundberg reminded me as he sat beside me at the table that it was the exact same conversation that was had in roughly the early 2000s after the sidewalk issue had fallen to the wayside of complaints. The key, it seems to me, is very simple. It's the administration's job. They get paid. They're the professionals. They know the law. They know the requirements of engineering. They know what it would mean to enforce 2 sidewalks on both sides of the road, the cost that might mean to tear up the entire road to get it to a level, since a lot of our roads were built with that roundedness for the purpose of drainage. They know the challenges of putting somebody's feet onto the pavement to go look at those sidewalks, and there is a cost to that. I can only say to you again, as it was referenced when I was Sidewalks chair, we had the exact same conversation. And we put a plan of 20 years out there, which was 10 years ago, which allowed for most every one of the gaps to be filled in, every one of the determinations to be made, and didn't even take into account the extra special things that we've begun to do. And as Jeff noted, you know, I came from a very affluent town in outside of Chicago called Glen Ellen, Illinois. And the city council in that day said, we're replacing every sidewalk in the city. 23,000 people, every road had 2 sidewalks on it. And guess what? You're paying for it. And guess what? A whole bunch of people showed up at city council. No, 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 no. And guess what the city council did? They said, we don't care if you vote us all out of office. We need to do this for the safety, the health, the property values, the ability to get people from one place to another. Now, it's really hard to always be asking questions. Somebody needs to put a plan on the table. I think that's the administration's responsibility. It's your responsibility to act on it, say we like it, we don't like it. We're going to give variances to this person or that person. And there's all sorts of other nuances that, you know, haven't even been mentioned tonight. One of the things, and I don't know if it's still on the books, but we found out when the mayor told me, when he says, well, you know, Reverend Plant, it's going to cost you $12,000 to put a sidewalk on your part of Maywin. And I think he was surprised that I didn't flinch, because I knew that my home value was immediately going to go up 10% with a sidewalk in front of it. And it might also solve some of the drainage problems that happen in my yard and in my neighbors' yards. But one of the things we discovered was that if for some reason you only want to put 1 sidewalk instead of 2 on a road, you can actually assess the person who's across the road who isn't getting the sidewalk, because they're getting the benefit of that sidewalk if they're going to cross over the road. Bottom line, where there's a will, there's a way, and when there's a plan, there's a way to get something done. All your questions are good. I just want to encourage you not to have this stupid ass question again 10 years from now. Because trust me, that little bit of $12,000 that it was probably going to cost me the last time I was on council, which is, Josh, when were you elected? Was that 3 years ago now or 2?
Just about 3.
Just about. Back then it was going to cost 12, and I have absolutely no doubt that if I got that same estimate, it would probably be up to 13 or 14 if I didn't have somebody else to call and do it, Steve. And the reality is, it's never going to get cheaper, folks. Last night at the gas station, and this will be the last part of my Reverend G sermon, you know, a guy said, gas prices are going up to $4.56 tomorrow. And he was filling up 10 buckets, not buckets, but, 10 5-gallon containers of gasoline. I just happened to be, my lawnmower gasoline was out, so I needed to get some. And I said, I understand that that's a burden, but guess what? In 1973, when gasoline went from 35 cents to 55 cents, that's the same differential as when gasoline now has gone from $2.25 to $4.50. And it was awful, and there were lines, and people complained, and they fought over it. It's never gonna be cheaper than it is right now. And, if you look at it in a 10 or 20-year plan, it will be a great thing. So you all need to hear what they're saying. Because what I heard over and over again was city council members bailed anytime we tried to have a plan. Ask them to get the plan, ask them to put it out there, and when 35 people come here, stand up and say, look, you don't like it? That's fine, but we're going forward with it. Don't vote for me the next time. And I know that's hard. Trust me, I know that's hard. But I encourage you with that. Because I'm very serious about this, with the exception of those special things on the board. You didn't say one thing new tonight that wasn't said 10 years ago. And not one new thing that wasn't said 20 years ago. It needs to stop. Make the decision. Get after it. And if you need to refer everybody to me, I'll be glad to take all those complaints. I'm used to getting them as a pastor. God bless you all.
Thank you. Thanks for being our guest. Any other questions or comments? With that, do we have a motion, question?
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn for this evening? Second, Mr. Mast. All those in favor of adjourning for this evening, say aye.